Kino here, and today we're going to be cooking up apple strudel using a biscuit crust. So let's get started. So to start your strudel, you want to prepare your pan, and I have here parchment on a baking sheet, and this will be a large enough baking sheet to do 4 strudels that are individual size, or you could do 2 larger ones, or possibly 1 quite large one. Although baking times are going to vary depending on the size you make, and I'm going to be doing the individual ones. And I've already preheated my oven to 375, so it's ready. So we're starting out with, I've got 500 mils of flour here, and we're going to add all the dry ingredients together. That's the first step. This strudel uses actually a biscuit crust for it, and so the first step is to mix all your dry ingredients together, same as if you were doing any biscuit type recipe, a scone or that kind of thing. So I've got 500 mils of flour, and I'm adding 15 mils of baking powder and 2.5 mils of salt, 30 mils of sugar. There's a little more sugar in this than there might be in a biscuit recipe because it's a dessert type thing. And you're going to stir these together. Now you can use anything you want to stir this. You could use a wooden spoon or a whisk or anything like that, but I'm using a fork because this is going to be my primary mixing utensil for this recipe, and I always like to avoid creating extra dishes if I can help it. So once those are all blended together, then we are going to add our butter. And I have 125 mils of cold butter. Very important in a biscuit that the butter is cold because that's important to the texture, and I'll talk about that as I'm cutting this in. So we're going to do something called cutting in, and when we cut in the butter, we are breaking it up into little pieces and distributing it through the fat. Now I'm going to use a fork, and I just press my fork into those pieces of butter, and I cut it into pieces to make it easier to do this step. And I'm going to press the back of my fork into those pieces of butter and basically break them apart. Now, if you have a pastry blender is actually designed to do this. It's almost the only thing you do with a pastry blender. I would show you one, except I don't actually have a pastry blender. I bought one once and I didn't like it, and I don't keep things I don't like. So I got rid of it. I grew up watching my mom use a fork, and my grandma probably used a fork too. And I just learned how to do this with that utensil, and that's what I'm comfortable with. Now you can use your fingers, but you have to be careful because fingers will warm up the butter, and we want to keep it cold. The idea is that we want these pieces of butter to stay in this mixture until they get in the oven, and then they will melt. And when they melt, they create little pockets in the dough, and those pockets get filled up. The baking powder, when you add liquid to it, it creates a chemical reaction, and part of that reaction creates carbon dioxide, which is a gas. And so those little pockets get filled up by carbon dioxide from the baking powder and the action of the baking powder. And then the carbon dioxide as a gas, when it's hot in the oven, it expands in the heat and makes those pockets a little bit larger, and that's what creates the flaky texture of a biscuit. So we don't want to melt this butter before we actually get it in the oven. We want it to be in pieces, and that's important to the whole mixing, because when we go into the next step on this, we don't want to again destroy those pieces of butter. We actually want them in the dough, and the same method is used if you're making any kind of pastry, like for pie crust or any of that kind of thing. So I'm breaking it up, and what I want is small pieces about the size of peas. Some recipes will say about the size of Rice Krispies, and I just basically, they don't all have to be exactly the same size, but you want roughly the same size. I saw someone on TV once doing this, and she froze her butter and then she grated it, like with a cheese grater. I haven't tried it that way. It sounds interesting as long as the pieces didn't get too small. I think that would work. Anyway, I can't remember, it was a cooking competition. I don't remember if she won or not, but that was how she did it. All right, this looks pretty good. So I've got, and some of them, they're not round. I mean, when we say peas, we're not necessarily meaning perfectly round little pieces. They're more like flat or a little bit elongated looking. They're all different sizes. But you can see there, it's kind of got a rough, crumbly texture, and that's exactly what we want here. So now I'm ready to add my liquid. Now this recipe says to add it gradually. I have to be honest, I usually just add it all at once. And I'm going to do that, and it's 200 mils of milk here. And again, your milk for this should be cold. You want to keep the butter cold, so having the milk colder is going to help do that. And you want to mix this until it comes together in a ball. Sometimes they call it following the fork around the bowl. So you can see how that is doing that, right? And there's just a tiny bit of flour in the bottom, but I'm going to take care of that with my next step. So now we're going to do a little bit of kneading. Now I don't want a lot of flour. You don't want to dry it out. I just need enough to keep it from sticking to the counter. And then I'm going to put that on the counter. Any crumbs that are in the bottom there, I just put on top of it. They're going to come together with it as I knead it. And now this kneading is very different from doing a yeast dough. This kneading is a gentle kneading. You're just bringing together the ingredients. Again, I do not want those pieces of butter to mix in completely. I want them to have some shape to them and be mixed throughout the dough. So I am going to fold it and push gently, but I'm not using my whole arm. I'm just basically using my hands. And the recipe says to do this, I believe, for about 8 to 10 strokes. And I don't usually count, I just do a few. I think I've done about 5, 6, 7, 8. A little more flour on my board. 9, and I think that's good enough. So now I'm going to do 4 individual strudels with this, and I just need to grab my knife. So I'm going to cut this into 4 pieces. And I'm going to reserve 3 of them. And a little bit of flour here. And I want to roll this out into a rectangle. Now sometimes it's challenging rolling things into a circle. It's even more challenging doing a rectangle. So I'm going to start by patting it. And I want my rectangle to be about 15 centimeters by 20 centimeters. So it's not going to be huge. And sometimes I will check it, and you can actually see when you look at this, you can see little bits of butter there, and that's exactly what I want. Sometimes I stop halfway through and turn it over just to make sure it's not sticking. Because if it's sticking a lot, when you go to take this up after you've shaped it into your strudel, it will tend to break apart. So when you're done, your dough should be about, and you see how I'm stopping and patting it and just trying to get that perfect kind of rectangular shape. It's not perfect, but it's close. So we're about 15 centimeters here and 20 centimeters here. And if you need to, you can get a ruler, make sure it's clean, and actually measure if you feel like you need to do that. I'm pretty good at visualizing, so I don't need to do that. But now we're going to take a knife. Just a paring knife is fine. You could even use a dinner knife because it doesn't have to be super sharp. And we're going to make some cuts. They're going to be about 1.5 centimeters apart, and they're about 1/3 of the way. If you imagine 1/3 and 1/3 and 1/3, these cuts are about 1/3 of the way towards the center of the dough. And I'm going to make them all the way up to the top. And then I'm going to go to the opposite side, and I'm going to do matching cuts. So for each cut here, I'm going to do another one on the opposite side. And that's prepped to actually shape my strudel. So I've already prepared my filling, and what I have here are 2 apples, 60 mils of sugar, and 10 mils of cinnamon. and I love my cinnamon, so it's a little dark. You could use less, but I think that'll be good. And about 1/4 of this is going to go on this strudel because I'm doing 4 of them. Now the apples are chopped, and it's just a rough chop. If you remember from when we did knife skills, chopping pieces are not all identically sized. You want them sort of similar. And so some of mine are a little smaller than others. But if you make them too big, it's hard to shape your strudel. So some of these I maybe could have cut a tiny bit smaller than what they are. And I'm just trying to make sure I don't use too much on one strudel so I have enough for all of them. Now, if you wanted to try other berries, I do not recommend frozen for this recipe because the dough, frozen berries have a lot of moisture and the dough gets soggy. And so even fresh ones, things like strawberries and raspberries might have too much moisture in them to use in a recipe like this. I mean, if you want to experiment, you can, but I personally love them with the apple. Now, we are going to do, I guess, sort of a weave. It's not a braid because we don't have 3 strands. We've only got 2. So I'm going to take the top one and move it across the apples a little bit on a diagonal, and then I'm going to take the second one and I'm going to cross it over top of the first one. And I'm just going to continue down, crossing the left over the right. Actually, I'm putting the right over the left. Sorry, I'm left-right challenged. I have to always imagine a piano when I'm trying to figure out left and right. The only time it's easy is in a car. I know when I'm turning right, what right is, except if I'm giving someone else directions, I will tell them to turn right when I mean left. Anyway, now when you get to the bottom, the biggest challenge is this extra at the bottom because it's hard to make it look beautiful. So I usually just kind of tuck it around the bottom, like so, and do a little tuck around the top so it doesn't leak out too much. And there is your strudel. And I'm going to be making 4 more of these, and then I'm going to bake them. It takes about 20 to 25 minutes. And when they're baked, I'll bring them out and show you how to finish them off. So our strudels are hot out of the oven and ready to glaze. And you can see that this one looks really good here, but you can see a couple of them, the wrap came apart. So you want to make sure when you're doing that overlap that you pull a little bit and kind of almost stick it together so that it stays in place, which obviously didn't happen. However, even if they don't look perfect, they should taste great. Now we're going to glaze them. So I have here a glaze, and this is icing sugar. You want to sift that so there's no lumps in it. And so I've got 125 mils of icing sugar, 10 mils of milk, 2.5 mils of vanilla, and 2.5 mils of cinnamon. Now you'll see it's really thin. That's what a glaze is. It's just meant to be a light coating, and it doesn't look like very much. I'm even looking at this going, hey, I'm going to glaze 4 strudels with this. But I know from past experience, yeah, it's going to do 4 strudels. And so you just take it and spoon it over the top and let it drizzle down the sides. And basically that's all you do. I'm going to go back and forth here a little bit. And that just adds a little bit of sweetness on the top of your strudel. Enhances that apple and cinnamon and